The air in the archive was a specific kind of cold, a dry, paper-scented chill that seeped into the bones. It was the cold of forgotten things. Dr. Anya Petrov, a historian whose specialty was the unglamorous corners of the Eastern Front, was deep in the bowels of the former Soviet Central Military Archive, a monolithic gray building on the outskirts of Moscow. Her request had been routine: logistics reports from the 3rd Shock Army's supply depots, winter of 1942. The board attendant had dumped a heavy, dust-caked cardboard box on her desk with a thud that echoed in the silent hall. For hours, she sifted through brittle manifests for shells, boots, and tinned beef. Then, nestled between a sheaf of ration tickets and a complaint about substandard winter coats, her fingers brushed against a single sheet of onion skin paper, so thin it felt like a ghost's skin. It was a carbon copy. The purple ink faded to a faint bruise. It wasn't a logistics report. It was a single, typed paragraph appended to a routine situation update from the 47th Independent Signals Battalion. It bore no official letterhead, only a handwritten notation in the margin. For internal disposition only, do not file. Her Russian, fluent from a childhood spent with her émigré grandparents, parsed the dry, bureaucratic language. It spoke of temporary cessation of signals intelligence gathering in Sector Gamma 7 due to catastrophic loss of personnel and specialized equipment during an unsanctioned engagement 17 to 19 November 1942. Assets unrecoverable. Recommend all future patrols avoid grid reference 44V9. No further action to be taken. She froze. Sector Gamma 7? That designation wasn't on any of her maps. Grid reference 44V9. She pulled out her laminated wartime topographical chart. The grid square corresponded to a blank spot in the dense forest south of Lake Ladoga, a place of no strategic value, a cartographic silence between 2 known front lines, a catastrophic loss of personnel and specialized equipment, an unsanctioned engagement. It began with a footnote. Barely a sentence in a forgotten archive box. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was the scent of something buried. Over the following weeks, the scent became a trail, a cryptic diary entry from a German signals officer, purchased from a private collector, mentioning a 3-day nightmare in the Teufelsschlucht, the Devil's Gorge. Our ears went blind. A pension file for a Soviet lieutenant abruptly closed in late November 1942, citing death in action, with the location left blank. A single grainy aerial reconnaissance photo in a U.S. intelligence file, declassified in the 1970s and misfiled, showing a patch of forest in that same grid square, utterly denuded, the trees splintered as if by a localized hurricane, with strange metallic debris glinting amid the mud and snow. A battle, not a skirmish, but a battle. A clash so violent, so decisively destructive, that its very outcome had shifted the calculus of entire strategic plans in the high commands of both Berlin and Moscow. Yet in the official histories, in the memoirs of generals, in the proud narratives of nations, it had no name. It left no monument. It was a void. Maps were altered. Reports were destroyed, or, like this one, hidden among the mundane. Survivors on both sides were silenced by secrecy oaths, by fear, or by the simple, crushing weight of an experience so anomalous it had no place in the accepted story of the war. This is the story of that clash. The story of a fight that shaped a front, determined the fate of a critical winter campaign, and then was, deliberately and meticulously, erased from the memory of the world. To understand the madness of what happened at Grid 44V9, one must first understand the geography of oblivion. In the late autumn of 1942, the front north of Leningrad was a tangled, frozen nightmare. The Soviet Volkhov Front and the German 18th Army were locked in a bloody stalemate. The fighting centered on roads, railways, and the scarce, hard ground of the Ladoga shore. Between these arteries of war lay the taiga,
a primordial, trackless expanse of pine, spruce, and sucking bog, deepening into a labyrinth of ravines and rocky outcrops as one moved east. This was a place where armies disappeared. It was a buffer of pure misery, deemed impassable for large formations by both German and Soviet high commands. In the middle of this nowhere was the Valka Valley. On military maps, if it appeared at all, it was a topographical curiosity, a deep, narrow cleft carved by an ancient river, now just a trickle. A tiny village, Podyam, clung to its western rim, a cluster of a dozen log houses whose inhabitants lived by trapping and subsistence farming. It was not on any supply route. It controlled no heights. It was, in the words of one German staff officer, militarily wertless, militarily worthless. But beneath the soil of the Valka Valley lay a secret, born of a catastrophic clerical error and a desperate technological gamble. In the frantic summer of 1941, as German Army Group North raced towards Leningrad, a special detachment of the Nachrichtenaufklärung, signals intelligence, was tasked with establishing a network of long-range listening posts to intercept Soviet military communications. Working from pre-war Soviet topographical maps the Germans later discovered were deliberately inaccurate, a team pinpointed a location deep in what they believed was secure rear-area forest, perfect for their sensitive directional antenna arrays. They built a station, codenamed Ohren des Norden, Ears of the North. It was a sophisticated installation, powered by a hidden generator, equipped with the latest German frequency scanning and recording equipment, and staffed with 30 of the Reich's best linguists and cryptographers. The error was only realized months later, in the chaos of the Soviet winter counteroffensive. A shift in the front lines, unrecorded due to broken communications, had placed Ohren des Norden not safely behind German lines, but merely 5 kilometers into a nebulous, uncontrolled sector that was for all intents and purposes no man's land. The valley was so remote and the fighting so concentrated elsewhere that the station operated for weeks in a surreal bubble of silence, unaware it was marooned. The Soviets, meanwhile, had their own secret. In early 1942, grappling with the devastating effectiveness of German radio intelligence, Soviet State Security, NKVD, initiated Project Molniya, Lightning. Its goal was to deploy a new, experimental radio scrambler/descrambler system, capable of rendering encrypted transmissions temporarily unreadable to anyone without the matching synchronized apparatus. It was a potential war-changing advantage. The prototype unit, bulky and temperamental, needed a hidden, stationary test site far from prying eyes and friendly ears that might mistake its output for jamming. The NKVD, reviewing captured German maps, chose a remote valley deep in the taiga, the Valka Valley. They forcibly evacuated the villagers of Podyam, telling them it was for a forestry project, and installed the Molniya apparatus in a reinforced concrete bunker dug into the valley's eastern wall. By October 1942, the impossible truth dawned on the few who knew the full picture in both high commands. 2 of the most sensitive signals intelligence assets on the entire Northern Front, one German, one Soviet, were sitting less than 2 kilometers apart in the same forgotten valley, each unaware of the other's precise nature, but each beginning to detect anomalous radio emissions that threatened their own operations. The German High Command, OKH, could not allow their premier listening post, with its code books and breakthrough into Soviet traffic, to fall into enemy hands. The Soviet Stavka could not allow the Molniya prototype, a jewel of their technical warfare program, to be captured or destroyed. And so, in the war rooms of Rastenburg and Moscow, secret orders were cut, not for a division or even a regiment, but for small, elite, deniable units. The Germans dispatched a battalion of the Brandenburger Regiment, their special operations troops, masquerading as a mountain reconnaissance patrol. The Soviets sent a company of NKVD frontier guards from the Special Designation Brigade, men used to operating in secrecy and silence, labeled on paperwork as a geological survey team. Both sides raced towards the Valka Valley. Both denied the race ever happened. Their orders were identical in their clandestine ruthlessness. Secure the asset, destroy any enemy force encountered, leave no trace.
The selection was not a matter of rank or seniority, but of a certain kind of expendability. Not expendable in value, these were some of the most highly trained soldiers in their respective armies, but expendable in terms of their ties to the conventional military structure. They were ghosts already, in a sense. For the Germans, it fell to the Brandenburger Lehr Regiment. Within this elite unit, a special battalion was culled. These were men with dual language skills. Many spoke fluent Russian or Ukrainian. They were masters of sabotage, reconnaissance, and operating behind enemy lines. But more importantly, they were men with minimal family connections back home, or whose records already contained a certain moral flexibility that made them ideal for deniable work. They were assembled at a remote Luftwaffe airfield in East Prussia under the guise of a long-range winter survival exercise. Their commanding officer, Hauptmann Erich Voss, a career soldier with the cold eyes of a practiced realist, addressed them in a hangar whose windows had been blackened. He did not mince words. "You are being deployed to secure a vital asset deep behind the current front line," he stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This operation does not exist. It is not on any battle map. You will carry no identifying insignia. Your paybooks and dog tags will be collected before departure. You will be issued generic winter camouflage and weapons that cannot be traced to our unit." He paused, letting the gravity sink into the frozen air. "Your orders will be memorized, then burned. You will be inserted by night landing. You will engage any enemy force you encounter with maximum violence. You will not retreat. Your success or your failure will never be acknowledged by the High Command. You will not be remembered in dispatches. Your only monument will be the completion of the mission. Do you understand?" There was no chorus of affirmation, only a stiff, silent nodding. These were professionals. They understood the subtext. You are already dead to the world. The only thing left is to make your death mean something to us. Across the lines, the selection process was equally grim, but bore the distinct fingerprint of Soviet state security. The NKVD did not request volunteers, it drafted them. From the ranks of the special designation border troops, men already used to operating with brutal autonomy in the vast, silent stretches of the frontier, a company was severed from its brigade. They were told they were to be the honor guard for a new critical scientific installation. Their political officer, a severe man named Commissar Ilyin, was blunter. "You are the shield of the motherland's most precious secret," he hissed, his breath forming clouds in the unheated barracks. "You will protect it with your last breath. There will be no reinforcements. There will be no glory. If you are captured, you are already traitors, for you should have died first. If you fail, your names will be erased from the rolls of the Red Army. Your families will receive no pension. You are instruments of the state. Instruments do not have names." Their standard-issue rifles were taken. In their place, they were given AVS-36 automatic rifles, a weapon rare on the front lines. Their uniforms were stripped of all unit patches. They were loaded onto unmarked ZIS trucks, their windows covered, and driven for 2 days over frozen tracks into the heart of the taiga. For both groups, the march into the Valka Valley was a descent into a silent world. The Germans, landed by Ju-52s on a frozen lake 10 kilometers away, moved in single file, their felt overbooted feet making no sound on the deep snow. They communicated with hand signals, their breath pluming in the Arctic air. The Soviets, disembarking from their trucks miles from Podlyom, did the same, a gray snake slipping through the monochrome forest. They were men marching not towards battle, but towards oblivion. They carried in their packs not personal effects, but extra ammunition, explosives, and a profound, unspoken understanding. The mission was everything. They were nothing. For over 100 men on each side, The tramp through the silent, snow-laden pines was their last march. They were entering a door history was already closing behind them. The Volga Valley, already a place of deep shadows and muffled sound, began to change on the evening of November 17th. It wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. Survivors from both sides, in their fragmented, private accounts, would later speak of it with superstitious dread. The air grew still, preternaturally still. Then, from the damp floor of the ravine and the icy surface of the trickling stream, a fog began to rise. It did not drift from the surrounding forests. It boiled up from the ground itself, thick, cold, and opaque as milk. It was a product of freak conditions, a sudden temperature inversion trapping the valley's moisture, combined with the latent heat from the two hidden power-generating installations, the German generator and the Soviet boiler for the Molnia bunker, creating localized convection. Within an hour, the valley was submerged. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters, then to arm's length. The world dissolved into a swirling, sound-deadening whiteness. This fog was the final tragic actor in the drama. Both the Brandenburgers and the NKVD troops had orders for strict light and noise discipline. They were moving on tight timetables to secure their objectives before dawn. The Germans were advancing from the west, aiming for the listening station. The Soviets were moving to tighten the perimeter around the Molnia bunker on the eastern slope. In the absolute blinding whiteness, their advanced scouts, the eyes and ears of each force, became useless. The collision was not dramatic. It was a sudden, shocking intimacy. A Brandenburger point man, his MP-40 at his hip, materialized out of the fog directly in front of a Soviet sentry who was relieving himself against a tree. For a frozen second, they stared at each other, two ghosts in a white void, each clad in anonymous white winter smocks. Then, instinct overrode recognition. The German fired a burst from the hip. The Russian died before he could button his trousers, his blood a shocking crimson Rorschach on the snow and fog. The gunfire was swallowed by the mist, but not silenced. It triggered instant, blind pandemonium. What followed was not a battle in any tactical sense. It was a chaotic, close-range massacre conducted by feel and sound. There were no front lines, no maneuvers. Units disintegrated into clusters of men firing at muzzle flashes in the gloom, to sounds of rustling, to the vague looming shapes that might be a man or a snow-laden pine. Artillery support, prearranged by both sides for emergency contingencies, became an instrument of terror. A German mortar team, completely lost, set up their tube and began dropping rounds based on a guess. The explosions bloomed like dull white flowers in the fog, killing Germans and Soviets with indiscriminate fury. A Soviet platoon commander, panicked, used a field phone to call in Katyusha fire on his own map coordinates. The shrieking salvo of rockets tore through the canopy, showering the entire Central Valley with splintered wood and red-hot metal, setting the fog itself momentarily aglow with an infernal diffused light. Tanks, a handful of German Panzer IIIs and Soviet T-60s attached to each force for heavy support, became monstrous blind beasts. Their commanders, buttoned up and seeing nothing through their slits, drove by compass bearing alone. A T-60, grinding forward, crashed directly into a sunken German supply sled, then pivoted wildly, its tracks churning men and equipment into a pink slurry before it lurched over the edge of a small ravine and wedged itself there, its machine gun firing uselessly into the earth. The sensory deprivation was total. Men reported hearing voices whispering orders in Russian just feet away, only to turn and see nothing but shifting vapor. They heard the screams of the wounded, but could not find them. They fired at the echoes of their own gunfire. A German NCO later scrawled in a water-damaged diary found on his body, "We are shooting at ghosts. The fog is alive with them. It shoots back. I saw Ivan's face in the mist, then it was gone. My own man? I do not know. We are all ghosts now." A Soviet soldier, in a letter he never finished, wrote the phrase that would come to encapsulate the horror. Tenyi strelyayut v chenyi. Shadows, firing at shadows. Time lost all meaning.
In the featureless white and roaring hell, the battle seemed to last an eternity. For others, it was a frantic, compressed burst of violence that was over in moments, leaving them alone and deafened in sudden, eerie quiet. No one could agree. Was it 3 hours of constant fighting, or 20 minutes of concentrated, apocalyptic violence? The fog had stolen not only their sight, but their sense of duration. It was a battle without a shape, without a narrative, a raw, formless wound in the fabric of the war. It was simply the clash in the white, a blind, bloody groping where the enemy appeared without warning and vanished just the same, leaving only the dead and the dying in the...
The fourth day in the Volga Valley dawned not with light, but with a slow, seeping grayness that did little to lift the gloom from the churned, blood-soaked earth. The battle had degenerated into a state of pure, grinding attrition. The initial shock of the clandestine clash was gone, replaced by the visceral, animal reality of two elite forces locked in a death grip. The Brandenburgers, masters of infiltration, were now fighting a static war of snipers and sudden, vicious, close assaults from their network of shallow trenches and fortified logs. The NKVD Special Designation Troops, experts in defensive extermination, held the concrete bunker in the eastern slope with a fanatical, silent tenacity. In the German command post, a deeper dugout reinforced with stolen Soviet timbers, Hauptmann Erich Voss stared at a map that was now more conjecture than cartography. His radio operator lay dead beside him, the set shattered by a Soviet anti-material rifle round. His company, which had numbered 180 of the Reich's most resourceful soldiers, was reduced to perhaps 70 effectives. They were low on ammunition, lower on morphine, and had not eaten a hot meal in 96 hours. The Soviet jamming, a constant maddening static hiss, punctuated by bursts of screech and tonal interference, had rendered their remaining field radios useless. They were isolated. The promised relief from the 254th Infantry Division had been stalled by a sudden violent Soviet artillery barrage on the distant road, a barrage Voss now suspected was triggered by the very intelligence his own captured station had provided before it went silent. Across the valley, in the stifling diesel-fumed air of the Molnia bunker, the situation was a mirror image. Lieutenant Colonel Grigory Koval's force was down to a handful of defenders. The precious technicians, the only men who understood the blinking lights and spinning reels of the Molnia apparatus, had been killed one by one, picked off by German snipers whenever they ventured near the observation slits. The machine itself was damaged. A stray shell fragment had pierced its cooling system, and it was running dangerously hot, its signals growing erratic. Koval knew the directive from Moscow: destroy the equipment if capture is imminent, but the order felt like a sin against the motherland. This machine could change the war. To smash it with a grenade was to admit defeat. It was at this precise moment of exhausted, desperate stalemate that the fog of war, thickened by secrecy and denial, produced a final, catastrophic irony. 20 kilometers to the southwest, a battery of Soviet 152mm howitzers, part of a standard divisional artillery regiment supporting a planned but minor push near the main road, was preparing for a fire mission. Their forward observer, a young lieutenant shivering at a tree line, was confused. His maps were outdated. His radio connection to battalion was plagued with strange interference, a wavering, ghostly howl that sounded like no jamming he'd ever heard. He was trying to call in fire on a suspected German mortar position in a grid square that on his map showed empty forest. Through his scope, he thought he saw movement, a flash of gray. He made a calculation, an educated guess, based on faulty data. He called in the coordinates. The gun crew, weary veterans of the Leningrad siege, went through their practiced routine. They had no idea their target was not a mortar nest. They had never heard of the Volga Valley. The coordinates were just numbers. They loaded the heavy, high-explosive shell, set the charges, and yanked the lanyard. The gun roared, kicking back in a cloud of frozen mud. The shell described a high, silent arc through the leaden sky. It reached its apogee and began its descent, not towards any German mortar, but towards the heart of the secret battle. For Erich Loss, the end came as a sudden, impossible pressure, a feeling of the very air being sucked from his lungs. He looked up from his map, and the world turned white. For Grigory Koval, deep in the bunker, it was a sound beyond sound, a colossal, concrete-rending crump that felt like the mountain itself had been struck by the fist of God. The lights died. The ceiling rained concrete dust and rebar. the 152mm shell, through a 1/1,000,000 confluence of error and interference, struck not the German lines, not the Soviet lines, but the one structure that sat between them, the captured Ohren des Nordens listening station. It impacted the reinforced concrete roof directly. The blast was cataclysmic. The high-explosive filler detonated with the station's own fuel stores and secondary power cells. The resulting explosion was not merely a detonation, it was an eradication. A fireball, tinged chemical green from burning electronics, bloomed in the center of the valley, vaporizing the station and everything within a 50-meter radius. The shockwave ripped through the frozen ground, collapsing trenches and dugouts on both sides of the line. Men were killed not by shrapnel, but by pure concussive force, their lungs crushed inside their chests. The shockwave also triggered a secondary disaster. In the Molniya bunker, the overstressed apparatus, shaken violently and deprived of power, experienced a catastrophic feedback surge. Its banks of capacitors discharged in a single furious pulse of raw electromagnetic energy. Every unshielded piece of electronics within a kilometer, German field telephones, Soviet radio sets, even the ignition systems in a few hidden vehicles, was fried, their components fused into useless slag. More horrifyingly, the pulse traveled up the bunker's own antenna array and blasted out across the ether. For 3 seconds, every radio receiver across the northern front, from Leningrad to Lake Onega, heard a deafening digital scream, a sound like tearing metal and static, before silence returned. Then, the true silence fell. The shooting stopped. The valley was filled with a ringing quiet, broken only by the moans of the dying and the crackle of fires. The prize over which they had fought so savagely, the treasure both high commands had deemed worth this secret blood sacrifice, was gone, vaporized, along with most of the men sent to secure it. The few survivors, perhaps 20 dozen from both sides combined, staggered from the ruins. They were deafened, bleeding, their uniforms smoldering. They looked across the scorched, apocalyptic landscape at each other. There was no fight left. A German Obergepreiter, his face blackened, simply dropped his rifle into the mud, turned, and stumbled into the woods. A Soviet sergeant, clutching a shattered arm, watched him go, made no move to stop him. The battle was over. It had ended not in victory or defeat, but in absolute, mutual annihilation. Years later, in the sanitized histories of Soviet engineering triumphs, the Molniya project would be listed as a theoretical study discontinued due to technical impracticalities. German post-war accounts of signals intelligence would make no mention of a station codenamed Ohren des Nordens in that sector. Engineers and archivists on both sides, when asked, would claim the facility never existed. But the land remembered. In the late 1950s, as civilians slowly returned to the region, a trapper from a resettled podium found strange melted lumps of black plastic and twisted copper wire in a gully where the soil was unnaturally barren. A boy fishing in the trickle of the Valka River pulled a jagged shard of steel from the bank, stamped with a German manufacturer's code and a serial number that, when quietly checked against surviving records, corresponded to a component of a high-frequency radio directing finder. Fragments of equipment, like shards of a buried meteor, told a story the official record refused to utter. The silence from the high commands was immediate and absolute. In Berlin, the OKH received a final broken Morse code signal from a surviving Brandenburger radio operator who had fled to a prearranged exfiltration point. Valka Valley operation terminated, asset destroyed, heavy losses, no enemy asset secured. The officer who received it stamped it Geheime Kommando Sache, top secret commander's business, filed it in a personal safe, and informed his superior. The decision was clinical. The operation had never been authorized through normal channels. To acknowledge it now would be to admit to a catastrophic failure in both intelligence and special operations. The men lost were deniable. In Moscow, the NKVD reported to the Stavka in even terser terms. Molniya site compromised and rendered inoperable. Enemy force destroyed, no survivors from enemy unit to capture. Our losses, total. Stalin's response via Beria was a single line: erase the incident. And so, the machinery of forgetting ground into motion. For the families of the fallen, the news came in lies. A letter to a mother in Hamburg stated her son, a Brandenburger Obergepreiter, had died heroically in a reconnaissance patrol near Muga, a frontline town over 100 kilometers away. His comrades, who might have told the truth, were mostly dead, and the few survivors were transferred to the frozen hell of the Eastern Front proper, where most perished within months.
A telegram to a wife in Gorky informed her that her husband, an NKVD lieutenant, had fallen during the defense of the Leningrad supply route, his body unrecoverable. The medals that followed, the Iron Cross, the Order of the Red Star, were engraved with the false locations. Maps were next to be cleansed. German staff cartographers, updating situation maps, simply smoothed over the Volga Valley, removing the subtle contour lines that denoted the deep ravine, making it appear uniform, unbroken forest. Soviet mapmakers in their next print runs did the same and went further, removing the village of Podyum entirely. The valley was cartographically flattened, made unremarkable, made to disappear.
The silence seeped into the highest levels. One German general, whose portfolio included special operations, made a single entry in his private diary on November 21, 1942, an entry that would be discovered by historians decades later. The affair in Grid 44V9 is closed, a costly lesson in the fog of war. No battle occurred there, but the blindness we now experience on the northern flank, we are still living with its consequences. He was referring to the sudden, post-November blackout in reliable signals intelligence from that sector, a gap German commanders felt but could never explain. The consequences were real. The destruction of Oren des Nordens crippled a key German ear on Soviet communications for a critical period, contributing to intelligence failures that preceded successful Soviet offensives in the region later that winter. The loss of the Molniya prototype set back Soviet electronic warfare efforts by years. The battle had, in fact, shaped the tactical and intelligence landscape of the Northern Front, but in a negative, subtractive way, by removing capabilities rather than gaining them. Even in the post-war era, the cover-up held. When historians like Dr. Anya Petrov began to piece together the puzzle, they ran into walls of silence and official confusion. They found gaps in unit diaries for those dates. They found casualty lists from November 1942 that showed strange, unaccountable spikes in missing or killed in action location unspecified for units known to be in reserve. They would follow a trail of documents to a certain point, only to find the next file missing, destroyed in a warehouse fire, or simply not transferred to the central archive. The valley itself, reclaimed by the relentless taiga, did the final covering. The craters filled with water and became peat bogs. The shattered trees were overtaken by new growth. The concrete bunker entrance was dynamited by a later Soviet engineering unit on training maneuvers. The Volga Valley simply disappeared from the narrative of the war, a black hole in history, swallowing the truth of a battle that never happened and the men who never died there. The silence, once imposed, became its own institution. The Volga Valley, now a serene patch of dense birch and pine, its floor a soft carpet of moss over the bones of men and machinery, held its secret for generations. The war ended. The Iron Curtain descended. The architects of the cover-up, men like Beria's NKVD apparatchiks and the Brandenburger command staff, met their own fates, in purges, in war crimes tribunals, or in quiet, pensioned obscurity, taking their knowledge with them. The battle was not just forgotten. It was entombed under the colossal competing mythologies of the Great Patriotic War and the crumbling narrative of the Third Reich's military precision. It had no place in either, but history, like water, finds its way through cracks. It began not in a state archive, but in an attic in Dresden. In 1998, an elderly woman named Hilda Schaefer passed away. Her nephew, clearing the cluttered space of her apartment, found a small, tin-lined trunk, its leather straps brittle with age. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and smelling of mothballs, were not family heirlooms, but the effects of her brother Klaus. Klaus had been a Brandenburger, listed as missing near MGA in November 1942. Hilda had never accepted it. She had kept everything the army had returned to her, a few personal items, some letters, and a small, privately developed photograph album. Her nephew, a history teacher, flipped through the album. Most pictures were benign, training exercises, blurred shots of comrades, but the last 3 pages stopped him cold. They showed men in distinctive Brandenburger smocks, not in the swamps near MGA, but in a deep, snow-dusted forest ravine. In one, they posed before a concrete structure with a heavy metal door, a door stenciled with a German eagle and the words Ohren des Nordens, String geheim. The final photo was a chaotic, blurred image taken from ground level, showing a Soviet soldier in a distinctive NKVD Budianovka hat collapsing, a geyser of mud erupting behind him. On the back, in Klaus's tight script, was written Tag 3, Teufelsschlucht, Hell, Day 3, Devil's Gorge, Hell. Simultaneously, in a dilapidated Kommunkala in St. Petersburg, a retired Soviet artillery officer named Viktor Yudenko finally succumbed to the cancer he had fought for a decade. His granddaughter, clearing his single room, found a packet of letters tied with string, hidden behind a loose baseboard. They were not love letters, but a series of frantic handwritten reports he had drafted as a young lieutenant in November 1942, and then, clearly, never submitted. They were addressed to his battalion commander, detailing a catastrophic targeting error during a fire mission on Grid 44V9, a sector we were told was unoccupied by our forces. The last line of the final draft was underlined twice. I believe we have fired upon our own elite troops. God forgive us. He had kept them, a festering secret of his own, for over 50 years. These two private, powerless collections of truth, a box of misfiled photos, a packet of personal letters, drifted through the post-Cold War world. The history teacher in Dresden, intrigued, posted scans of the photos on a small, niche forum for wartime photography. The granddaughter in St. Petersburg, seeking some closure, gave the letters to a local university archive where they sat uncatalogued for years. It was Dr. Anya Petrov, the historian with the scent for archival ghosts, that connected them. Her own research had led her down a labyrinth of dead ends, but she had established the key coordinates. Grid 44V9, November 1942, Signals Intelligence, NKVD Special Designation. The German forum post, stumbled upon during a late-night digital trawl, was a lightning strike. The concrete bunker, the Brandenburger uniforms, the date estimated by the clothing and light, it all aligned. She tracked down the history teacher, and through him obtained high-resolution scans. Then, with a scholar's persistence, she began inquiring at provincial Russian archives about personal papers relating to artillery actions north of Ladoga, winter 42. After 2 years of polite rejections, an archivist in St. Petersburg, remembering the Yudenko donation, sent her a PDF. The convergence was overwhelming. The German photo showed the station. The Soviet letter described destroying it. The German casualty was listed at MGA. The Soviet officer feared firing on his own troops. The NKVD file she had found initially spoke of a catastrophic loss. It was a perfect, terrible circle of evidence. The truth, when fully assembled, was simple and devastatingly mundane in its tragedy. This was not a heroic last stand. It was not a brilliant tactical coup. It was a colossal, multi-layered blunder. It was a blunder of cartography, using flawed maps. A blunder of secrecy, where the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing, even within the same army. A blunder of communication, where jamming bred fatal misunderstanding. A blunder of execution, where elite troops were sacrificed for assets that were ultimately fragile and destructible. The battle was a stark, concentrated dose of the chaos and stupidity that pervades all wars, stripped of the justifying rhetoric of cause and campaign. And this was precisely why it could not be acknowledged. The Battle of Volga Valley did not fit the official story. For the Soviets, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War was one of heroic, increasingly skilled resistance guided by the infallible hand of the party and the Supreme Command. It did not include tales of NKVD special forces being accidentally obliterated by their own artillery in a secret fight over a machine that didn't work. It showcased the genius of Soviet engineers, not the loss of a prototype due to catastrophic operational security failures. For the Germans, the myth of the Brandenburger and of the Wehrmacht's technical and operational superiority was a vital propaganda tool. It did not accommodate the story of an entire company of these super soldiers being chewed up in a meaningless, static brawl in a forgotten valley, their prize intelligence asset lost to a random shell. The battle changed a campaign. The intelligence blackout it caused on the German side had tangible effects. The setback to Soviet electronic warfare was real. But these were negative spaces, absences that influenced events in subtle, untraceable ways. They could not be celebrated or even cleanly analyzed. They were simply voids where advantage had been lost. Most of all, it embarrassed everyone involved. It embarrassed the German High Command for losing a crown jewel of intelligence. It embarrassed the NKVD for failing to protect a state secret. It embarrassed the artillery lieutenant who pulled the lanyard. It embarrassed the staff officers whose paperwork had created the fatal confusion. In the grand tragic narrative of a world war, the Volga Valley was a scene of pure, unvarnished farce. And farce is the one thing no military or political power can tolerate in its history. And so by unspoken agreement across the ideological divide, the world was never supposed to know. The men were